Chapter 6 of My Flirtations by Ella Hepworth Dixon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 6. The provincial young man has never possessed any attractions for me, and it is certain that, if I had not gone up north to stay with Daisy Drysdale, I should never have known so well such a striking specimen of the type as Dr. Stiles. He was not a bad fellow, but he was naively pleased with himself and his belongings. Your provincial, indeed, is rarely modest. In the limited circle of country town society a suitable young man is pursued with too much pertinacity and ardor to have any doubts in his own mind as to his personal desirability and manifold charms. Dr. Stiles was a stoutish person of 32, with nondescript features and a slow, portentous manner, along with a large and increasing practice in the suburb of Northaw, where his medical skill was in constant request among the spinsters and widows of that somewhat damp and chilly neighborhood. So highly esteemed were his services in the sick room that these ladies would send for him at all hours of the day or night, until the good doctor in self-defense took to sending his red-haired assistant to some of his more flagrantly imaginary invalids. Daisy Drysdale's husband was a manufacturer in Mudchester, and, like other manufacturers, he lived as far away from the factory chimneys of that thriving city as possible. So his brand-new red-brick mansion lay on the other side of the suburb of Northaw, and the society of Northaw supplied nearly all Mrs. Drysdale's intellectual recreation. Poor Daisy! How she missed London! And what, as she plaintively asked, was the use of her giving little dinners, seeing the component elements of which her parties were to be henceforward composed? Still she was not to be baffled, and Mrs. Drysdale constantly entertained. She kept open house, too, and was delighted to see people drop in of an evening. The very night I arrived, by some chance Dr. Stiles came in about 9 o'clock. They were playing whist at one end of the long drawing-room, and I was set down to entertain the doctor at the other. I shall not easily forget that night. Accustomed to the manifestly insincere gushings of London young men, I was amused at the naive manner in which this country Aesculapius comported himself. For a long time we talked of the last exhibition at Burlington House, for he remembered father's pictures, and was much impressed, apparently, by the fact that he was talking to an academician's daughter. The provinces are still impressed by the Royal Academy. They played more than one rubber of whist that night, but Dr. Stiles remained until the end. Before he left he had offered to lend me a horse, proposed that he should drive me to a ruin 10 miles off, and expressed a wish that I should know his 3 sisters. The drive to the ruin had assumed the proportions of a picnic before 3 days were over. Life, as someone has justly observed, would be tolerable if it were not for its pleasures, and possibly our English summers would be less dreary to look back upon were it not for the inevitable picnic. The day declared itself gray and chilly, with watery-looking clouds hanging despondingly overhead; but as it was not actually raining, we of course felt obliged to start. The doctor drove Mrs. Drysdale and me, and as he had to stop and see several patients on his way out of Northaw, we were 3/4 of an hour late when we arrived on the festive scene. We found our friends reclining on rugs and cushions in a damp field, where there was an unmistakable odor of manure. We found also that they were already more than half through the meal; for, as they justly observed, the cold had made them uncommonly hungry, though the quantity of well-picked bones and empty bottles sufficiently proclaimed the fact. But the mention of empty bottles suggests an air of hilarity which did not belong to this particular feast. A number of total abstainers were of the party, and these had brought their own supply of perry, lemonade, and mineral waters, and now sat apart round one tablecloth, surveying with somewhat unsheep-like glances the goats who were imbibing shandy gaff and claret. This attitude on the part of non-alcoholic Northaw not being conducive to sociability, the party as a whole cannot be said to have been, as the French say, of a mad gaiety. The doctor did his best, but he had not the light social touch. If he offered you the salad, it was with a portentous air; or did he spread you a cushion, he never dropped his professional manner. Several untoward accidents marred what was left of the day. A young lady had hysterics at the back of the ruin, and the doctor, who was fetched just when he was showing me the view from the topmost turret, muttered something distinctly ungallant about his prospective patient as he hurried off. A drizzle began just as the tea was laid, and the rain fell in dismal earnest as we drove home to Northaw. The next time I saw our friend Dr. Stiles, my head was tied up in a flannel shawl, and my throat was so swollen that I could hardly speak. The doctor had been called in professionally. The Northaw picnic had been too much for a Londoner uninured to the climate, and I was down with a malignant sore throat. The doctor came every day, and once he came twice, to work a patent inhaler and paint my throat with some mysterious compound. He constantly changed the treatment. It was as if he never could do enough. He even used to bring me flowers, and who ever heard of a doctor taking his patient flowers? Daisy was convulsed with amusement. She said that when she was ill she sometimes used to have to send for Dr. Stiles 2 or 3 times before he appeared, he was so busy. At the end of a week I was better, and in 10 days I was quite well. I really felt very grateful, for I knew that the doctor had saved me by his constant care from a dangerous illness. I wonder if he took my gratitude for something else? Anyway, as I told Christina when she scolded me for the whole affair, it was not my fault. The thing came quickly to a crisis. We were all invited to spend an evening at the doctor's house. In the North they have a mysterious meal called high tea, which is apparently a source of no little comfort and even of self-righteousness. It enables the habitual partakers thereof to allude witheringly to the late dinner indulged in by inhabitants of the South, and so if you are invited out in Northaw, be sure you will be regaled on tea and cold chicken, fearful mixture, on hot cakes, jam, marmalade, and currant buns. To this evening meal, then, we were bidden by Dr. Stiles. He lived alone with his sisters, who were curiously like him. They were all stoutish, with nondescript features, and had solemn and somewhat stolid manners. To see all 4 of them together inclined one to indecent mirth. It was impossible to be more worthy, more dull, and more self-satisfied. They sat in a circle in the long drawing-room on rather uncomfortable chairs. All 3 of the Misses Stiles took great interest in church matters, or at least in the curate, who was unmarried, and whom they consulted very often on the subject of soup tickets and flannel petticoats. The curate and a boy of about 19 years of age, with a shrill voice, were the other men of the party. Miss Stiles, the eldest of the 3 Miss Stiles, was a capital housekeeper. Everything went like clockwork in the doctor's roomy house. The early dinner was served to a minute. 2 o'clock was the hour. If the doctor were out, the meal proceeded with unfailing punctuality, a slice of mutton being kept hot in the oven for the master of the house. On the long, bare, lavender-colored walls of the drawing-room hung several water-colors by Miss Louisa. Indeed, the Misses Stiles were considered to have a pretty taste for art. They painted everything within reach with sprawling red roses or startling white daisies, the doctor being of opinion that his sister's artistic talent was of the first order. Miss Ada, too, was musical, and sang songs by Pinsuti and Milton Wellings. The doctor liked Miss Ada's vocal efforts. Miss Emily was literary. At least she assiduously read Miss Edna Lyle and Mr. Rider Haggard, and of these authors we discoursed solemnly until tea was announced. The table groaned with good things, with buttered toast, with salad, with vague dishes covered with custard, with ham, with quivering blancmange. The curate, it transpired, had a phenomenal appetite, though he coughed and expostulated when helped to a 3rd serve of pressed beef. Both he and the shrill-voiced boy had been among the abstaining sheep at our picnic. This evening meal, therefore, washed down by tea and coffee, had obviously no terrors for them. The conversation was not of the kind that dazzles. There were frequent pauses, during which Miss Ada made several bald statements about a forthcoming village concert, and the doctor, wishing to show his knowledge of the town, solemnly inquired if I had seen Mr. Irving in Henry VIII. The air was full of ominous portents. The doctor's manner, when he invited me for the 2nd time to partake of cold chicken, or pressed upon me, with northern hospitality, the currant cake, was full of a certain protecting pride, while a humbly conquering expression was in his eyes when they rested upon me. It was with intention, as the French say, that he showed me the photograph album full of aunts and cousins after tea. The good doctor looked quite sentimental when, later on, Miss Ada warbled a romance with waltz accompaniment entitled "The Love That Will Never Fade." I began to feel restless. More than once did I cross the room, engage either of the Misses Stiles in feverish conversation, I always ended by finding the doctor at my elbow. At last I resigned myself to my fate and sat down to talk to him. I imagined that the sanitary state of the suburb of Northaw would be a safe subject, and one unlikely to lead to a declaration of a tender nature, but in this, it appeared, I was mistaken. We got on to the subject of fevers, and to convince me on a certain point, the doctor suggested a reference to one of the medical books in his surgery. Once inside the little room, which lay just across the passage, Dr. Stiles shut the door, and advanced towards me with that particular expression which is so intolerable in a man one doesn't care for. I put on my most indifferent manner, and inspected with much interest the rows of medical books in their glass case. "So kind of you," I said hurriedly to fill up the dreadful pause, "to take so much trouble. Most doctors only laugh at you if one wants to know any real fact. About your dreadful trade," I added with flippancy, seeing that the man was not listening to a word I was saying, but was gazing at me as an amiable snake might be said to regard a sparrow. "Trouble," he said at last. "How can anything be a trouble that is done for you? I wish you would let me tell you how much I A sharp rap at the door interrupted this speech. A servant came in. "Please, sir, Mr. Brown is very bad, and Mrs. Brown says, will you come at once, and bring some of the drops, and she hopes you won't be long." "A 3-mile drive," said Dr. Stiles with a sigh, "and I shall not see you again to night." He took my hand and held it fast. "I will bring the book to morrow morning. Shall I have a chance of seeing you alone? Try to be alone when I come," and wrenching my hand violently, the doctor disappeared. "Daisy," I said hurriedly in the carriage going home, "I'm sorry to say, dear, I shall have to go home by the 10:15 to morrow. I had a telegram just before we came out." "You had a fiddlestick! What nonsense, Peggy! Why, you came to stay a month, and you've hardly been 12 days." "12 days? Good heavens! Why, how has he—" "Oh, it's that, is it? And so you don't like him? Well, I think you're silly. You might do much worse. How much better to settle down with someone like that than with one of your flipperty London young men. He's sensible, clever, a good fellow, well off, and very fond of you. The 10:15, please, Daisy." And sure enough, by the 10:15 I went. As the Yorkshire fields flew behind me on my rapid journey back to London, the whole thing seemed like some nightmare from which I had just awoke. Great heavens! From what had I not escaped? A lifetime of high tea, suburban gossip, and provincial self-sufficiency, of rose-bedecked door panels, the novels of Mr. Rider Haggard, and the love that will never fade. I am very fond of Mrs. Drysdale, but it will be a long time before I again trust myself to the seductions of that suburb of Mudchester. End of Chapter 6